and radish sprouts and looking into adopting HACCP. And so the publication also mentioned that there was to be a module plan for module HACCP plan for fresh cut produce is something that they highlighted in that paper. And then, so this is just kind of showing you that before there was the Food Safety Modernization Act, that the conversation of produce safety was coming up and that there were many options that they started considering way before the rule came into place. So when we talk about FSMA and the produce safety rule, some common terms that come up in those discussions is food safety plan and record keeping. So I started looking at more recent papers that were passed after the passing of FSMA. And so they were mentioning in the paper that there wasn't a really hard requirement of farms having a food safety plan. It is highly suggested, but they saw that accurate record keeping was something that the FDA was starting to get a little bit stern about as far as safe produce safety practices. And then they also said, you know, that requiring growers to maintain aspects in that produce safety rules. So once we started seeing this rule going into place, we saw that record keeping became a big deal. So author in a publication in 2018 talked about, you know, some of those documents that could be required when it comes to the produce safety rules, and they are all listed here. But some of them that we'll talk about a little bit today, I know we'll talk about food safety policies and procedures. Water testing is always a topic of discussion. I won't be talking about it today because I know we're still waiting on water testing final rules, so I won't talk about that today, but that's something that researchers have found that many growers need to keep more extensive written records about, as well as flooding. I know here I'm in the state of Iowa, and if it rains just a little bit too much, we can see in those cornfields the damage or the different areas that usually flood. And then also animal intrusion. So those are some big topics that you hear a lot of people either talk a lot about or some areas that people struggle with. But I think just getting started is one thing that you want to do. And so I'll highlight some of those key areas later on in the presentation. So Chan and others in 2021 did an extensive literature review about record keeping, well, about produce safety and the standards. And Dr. Fong was actually one of the authors of this paper. And so they highlighted the most kept records of growers, and then you'll see in the next slide the least kept records. And so good thing from that list that you saw previously, the most kept records were records of crops, applications of soil amendment, information about soil amendments when we talk about the type, the source, the interval, of time of application and harvest, water testing results, workers training information. And so those were some of the key areas, and it differed between those operations, but these are some of the key areas that they saw that that growers had good records of. As far as the least kept records, they saw a deficit in animal intrusion, flooding, crop testing, soil amendment testing, and water treatment. And so once again, we talk about, you know, keeping records is hard, and that's something that we struggle with too as scientists. And so trying to come up with good resources is the good thing to do, because as we talked about at the beginning, we say all the time in trainings, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So same thing on my end in the iWatch station. If I know that the iWatch station is not rusting, but I have to actually physically test it and actually write down when I've tested it. And so I kept saying, I said, we say this all the time, but I don't know where we got it from. And so this one paper that was published in 2011 talked about the good manufacturing practices. You see, it follows the same acronyms of the good agricultural practices, and this is for manufacturers. But this is a statement that was both in their abstract and within their papers. If it's not written down, it didn't happen. And so when we talk about documentations, the paper talks about encouraging and maintaining proper records, documentation and records, and saying that documentations help build a detailed picture of what is going on and what has gone on in the past and what is going on now. So talking about resources, and that's where I am happy about the different resources that our colleagues have developed. And so this is one when I did a search for record keeping and produce safety. This one came up from the Produce Safety Alliance at Cornell University. It does say on the document at the top that it is not a document that it is a best practice document, and it has not been approved by the FDA, but it was recently updated. And I think it's their way of it, and in the document it said it's their way of responding to questions that they received in trainings. And I also think that this will be a good resource for small growers to use to just get started with record keeping. And so in the following slides, I'll outline some of the key factors that kind of stood out to me and some key areas I think everybody can just start getting started with as far as their record keeping. So according to the document, they state that that records required by the produce safety rule must contain the following information outlined in Rule 112.161. And so, except as otherwise specified, all necessary records must include the name and the location of the farm, actual values and observations obtained during monitoring, an adequate description of the covered produce if applicable for records. So talking about the commodity name and the specific variety or brand type of commodity, and any lot numbers or identifiers. It also must include the location of the grower's area or other areas if applicable, sorry. And that's referring back to specific fields and packing sheds. And then the date and time of the activity. And then they also said that as far as records overall, they should be created at a time that the activity is performed, or the observation, so that the observation is accurable, legible, dated, signed, and initialed by the person who completed that activity. So in this document, they have several resources that you can go and use. I'm going to only highlight 3 of them, and they have stars by them. The qualified exemption, which is for those small growers, workers training record, and then cleaning and sanitation, because those are a good place to kind of get started when we talk about record keeping. I would advise, so when Autumn, I'm going to have Autumn send out the link, and I also can get the link and put it in the chat to you to this document to read over it and review it. I think it'll also be helpful for your post quiz if you want to use it as a resource. But I won't be going over all of this because we don't have enough time. And so I just want to make sure whatever I cover, that I cover it thoroughly and give you some good resources and tools for it. And so they have very good templates too that you could just print out or make your own and use for your operation.